Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Talking Stuff, the Ohio State recruiting podcast on Lettermen Row, available to you on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, all of your different podcasting platforms, web, blog,
all
viewing, wherever you want it, it's available. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. This is Spencer Holbrook. We are, again, talking Ohio State football recruiting. Every midweek edition is pretty much going to be handled in this capacity. Hopefully, you guys aren't too weirded out by the constantly changing style, but I'd just rather sit and talk to Spencer in person as opposed to doing it over the telephone like we do on Sundays. But Spencer, obviously, an important couple days for Ohio State on the recruiting trail. The most important and biggest news would be that the Buckeyes went ahead and offered a second quarterback in the class of 2020, Jayden de Laura from Honolulu, Hawaii, a player that they've been watching for a while now, and Mike Yurcich went out to visit last Friday, and now you see a program that is firmly committed to the idea of recruiting a second quarterback in this class and deciding to not put all their eggs in the CJ Stroud basket.
They're also deciding not to put all their eggs into the transfer portal basket like we might have thought they could if they wanted to, if they struck out on CJ Stroud. And I think one of the big things is Mike Yurcich in the biggest recruiting off week that they could possibly have, took an entire day, flew to Hawaii, talked to this kid, and flew back. I mean, he offered him in person. If you wanted to call him and say something, that's a whole different story. But they're committed to flying to Hawaii and talking to somebody. That means there is some interest there. This isn't just lip service. This isn't just let's save face and offer another quarterback to push the envelope with CJ Stroud. They went to Hawaii and talked to this kid, and that's a big tell for me.
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, they visited CJ Stroud during the first off week, and they can only go once in the evaluation period. So there seems to be a pecking list of where things stand, I guess, with Stroud and de Laura. But as you said, this is not an offer to de Laura which is made solely to try to push the envelope with CJ Stroud. This is a kid that they like. I don't know if they would take a yes answer from him today, but the point is, and the reason you make that offer is because it doesn't matter, because you know that de Laura, committed to Washington State, is not going to say yes right away. He's going to take some time. He has a USC offer that he just received last week. I expect that Michigan will get involved there as well as they look for a quarterback, as they've already done with CJ Stroud. So you know you have a little bit of time. And the good thing with de Laura is that there's a likelihood that he's actually going to wait until February to sign his letter of intent. So not only do you have this ability to say, hey, we offered you earlier than pretty much everyone else, you also have time to really build a relationship if things fall apart with CJ Stroud. But there's no relation to the feelings on Stroud with the decision to offer de Laura. They are completely separate. But you know, to the outside eye, it's going to look like, oh, well, they did this because they don't feel as good about Stroud. But that's just not the case. They have to get a second quarterback, and you can't sit there idly by while CJ Stroud gets offers from everybody in the country and is planning visits all over the country, including another one to Ohio State, and then hope that he's just going to be your guy, because you need to have a plan. I
think it's one of those rare instances in recruiting where you can say, what does it mean for player X if they offer player Y? And it actually doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Most of the time, there's that trickle-down effect. What does it mean by them taking Marvin Harrison Jr. for the rest of the recruiting cycle in 2021 for wide receiver? Well, it might mean somebody else is out. In this case, it doesn't mean anything. It just means they need a second quarterback, so they're offering two.
Yeah, you got to have options. The Buckeyes obviously have been working on the CJ Stroud recruitment for months. Ryan Day started that relationship with him back in the summer, and as I said, Michigan's involved there now. He's going to take 2 trips to Georgia in the next month. CJ Stroud will. He's heading back to Ohio State on December 14th. That's going to be the official visit. That's sort of a big one, because the plan, as CJ told us last week when we were visiting him in California, the plan is to sign on December 18th. And if he's at Ohio State the weekend of December 14th, then that sounds good for Ohio State. It means the Buckeyes are going to get the last shot at sitting down with him and his family, while Georgia and Oregon and Michigan and USC, who we visited for their game against Oregon last weekend.
Not a good look.
Not the ideal time to visit if you're USC. Obviously, they have a coaching decision to make.
A decision
which they're going to make, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But I just think it's interesting, the timing, because what people see is the offer means that CJ Stroud isn't coming to Ohio State, and there's just no reason to think that. So if that's what your natural inclination is because it's easier to be negative, then that's where you're going to go. But CJ Stroud isn't making a decision for another month. Jayden de Laura isn't going to make a final decision for at least another month, maybe 3. This is all about having ducks in a row so that when you have to get a second quarterback, you have options and not being forced on December 14th. If CJ Stroud decides I'm going to Georgia on the 18th of December, it's a lot harder to get involved with Jayden de Laura then, because at that point he's going to turn around and say, "Oh well, you didn't want me a month and a half ago, so why do you want me now? I'm sticking with the Cougars."
It's like your second option to the prom. If that person watches you ask somebody to the prom, they say no, and then they turn around and ask you. Hey, you're not going to feel too great about it.
It's totally different if you have them both in the room at the same time and say, "I want to go to prom with either of you."
I don't know. Maybe it wasn't the best analogy.
No, I mean, no, but in a way it is, because if it is different if you're asking somebody first and they say no, and then you're like, "Well, okay, you're also somewhat all right."
Yeah, you're also a quarterback who could play at Ohio State or be a backup at Ohio State. So the decision to offer him comes at an interesting time because everyone wants to talk about quarterbacks, but these offers couldn't be more separate. They couldn't be more. It's like you said, on December 14th, when CJ Stroud's sitting in Ryan Day's newly renovated office and he sees all these nice bells and whistles in the facility and he says, "I'm good. I'm going to go to Georgia." They can fall back and say, "Okay, Jayden, CJ said no. You're in if you want in." And you know this isn't just because. Right.
We already offered you. We would have let you do this a month ago if you wanted. So I think that's the important part of this quarterback recruiting puzzle. But as Spencer alluded to, don't expect the Buckeyes to go to the transfer portal if they don't have to. And I'm not even saying out of hand that in the event that they signed Jack Miller and CJ Stroud, that they still wouldn't look for a fifth-year senior quarterback to fit the profile of the roster. They want 4 quarterbacks on scholarship. They still would only have 3 heading into next year. I guess 4. You have Gunnar Hoke and then 2 quarterbacks. So maybe they'd be good. But the point is, the quarterback situation is far from settled, but it is also far from being a disaster right now. They've got a plan in place, and you can see that plan starting to unfold. So
there's also a clear path for Ryan Day to get back to the quarterback threshold that he wants, because I think that was a real concern at this time in the spring. I mean, in the spring, because when you go into a season with only 2 or 3 quarterbacks and 2 quarterbacks that know the offense really, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And Ryan Day talked about trying to build that quarterback room to where he wants it. And I think you're going to see it get to the level that he finally feels a little bit better about the future of the quarterback position.
They were completely blindsided by Matthew Baldwin's decision to leave the program. And if we're talking about Ohio State football, it's the one thing we constantly say this year, right? If Justin Fields gets hurt, things go totally different direction for Ohio State. They don't want to be in that position moving forward. Matthew Baldwin's decision to leave the program when he did put them in a real pickle. And so now it's about just getting, as Spencer said, back to level, essentially. So one thing that's interesting about CJ Stroud, putting a cap around the quarterback situation, his visit in December, is that there has been some talk about his good friend and 5-star linebacker Justin Flowe from Upland, California, who CJ and Rancho Cucamonga just knocked out of the league championship game on Friday. Justin Flowe making that visit with Stroud in December, and the Buckeyes are not looking for another linebacker in this class. So let's be clear, they're not looking for one. But if a player like Justin Flowe, who's a top 5 player nationally, decides he wants to come visit Ohio State, they are certainly not going to tell him no. And it's most interesting that it seems like it's Stroud who is pushing for Flowe to make that visit with him. Now, that could just be a quid pro quo because Flowe has been kind of helping or pushing for CJ Stroud to visit Georgia with him. But either way, if you have a quarterback who is uncommitted, but his good friend is one of the top 5 linebackers in the country, and that quarterback is the one saying, "Hey, you should also check out this school," it's another thing in the positive column for Ohio State when it comes to the timing of CJ Stroud's visit that I think you can sort of look at as an indicator of where he stands today.
I also think not only is it with Stroud, but I had a feeling that some of these 5-star prospects might wait and see what's Ryan Day going to do? What is this program going to look like under Ryan Day? And then I'll make a visit if I feel the need to.
Yeah.
And for him to just be friends with Stroud might be the cause of that, or might be just a secondary thing. You know, if he wanted to visit but wanted to see what Ryan Day had to offer first on the field, he could have waited and then say, okay, CJ, I will go on that visit with you. Because I think it's interesting. You're as a 5-star linebacker and as a top 10 player in the country, you're not just going to take your last official visit on the weekend before signing day to a program and have no interest.
In the middle of winter in Ohio. It's not like it's a travel trip that's just for fun. Again, the Buckeyes aren't looking for a linebacker. They have Court Williams committed, who sure he can play the bullet. You can check out the Bermanology with Court on Lettermen Row from earlier this week. Yes, they had Mitchell Melton, but I still think Melton is a guy who could potentially play with his hand in the dirt and maybe be a defensive end. And then you have Cody Simon. So really, in my mind, there's one true linebacker committed in the class of 2020, and that's Cody Simon. I don't know that there's any plan for Mitchell Melton to be a defensive end, but in my mind, again, this is just me, when I watch his tape, I see that 6'4", 240-pound frame. That's how I see him. He has lost some weight. He's down to like 225 is what he was at when he came to the Ohio State game a few weeks ago. But I think that if things continue to look like they're heading in another direction with a player like Tyler Barron, who, as things stabilize at Tennessee, is more likely to stay home and play for the Volunteers where his father works, then all of a sudden there's these options that you might have to explore if you're Ohio State, and maybe it makes it easier to turn around and tell a kid like Justin Flowe, if he decides to make this visit that's being discussed, hey, we only have one linebacker in this class. Your true Mike linebacker, Tough Borland and Baron Browning will both be gone after next year. This is sort of a plug-and-play situation for you. You have a young, energetic, dynamic linebacker coach in Al Washington. You're playing on one of the fastest defenses in the country. You're playing on one of the best defenses in the country. Oh, also, one of your good friends who's from California could be here as well. Let's see what we can do. So I think I wouldn't want Buckeye fans to get excited about this possibility, just the fact that it's being discussed, because Flo has talked about coming to visit Ohio State multiple times in the past. So has Noah Sewell, the linebacker in Utah, who's a 5-star middle linebacker prospect, but he's never visited either. But that's been a combination of need and opportunity. And right now, there hasn't been a need, but there may be an opportunity. And again, it's like Bijan Robinson. Some players are so good that if they decide we want to visit, you say, sure, we will fly you out here and give you that opportunity. And
don't think Ohio State won't have a plan.
Right.
If a 5-star kid like Justin Flowe says, I want to come to Ohio in the middle of winter and see what you have to say, you're going to lay out you're going to pull every stop, because this would just be the icing on the cake. Urban Meyer was always a closer, and he would always pull out a diamond in the rough on the last weekend of the recruiting cycle.
Yeah, we'd call it the urban surprise.
That no one knows about. Maybe this one's just been leaked. Maybe does Ryan Day have that same touch? We're going to find out in the next month, and I'm excited that it's getting so close. Well, I think it's a possibility.
You think about a kid like that coming to visit and taking an official visit on the weekend as the Buckeyes are preparing to go play in the college football playoff. Potentially. It adds a layer of excitement to that idea for him to realize that Ohio may be far away, but if you want to play in the college football playoff right now, there's 6 or 7 programs that are legitimate contenders year in and year out, and nobody outside of Alabama or Clemson who's more consistently involved in that conversation than Ohio State. So I think the interesting thing to watch with Flo is what happens at USC, because I know that there's all this talk about him and Clemson, but I still think that he's a kid who would prefer to stay out west. But with the unrest around Clay Helton's job, nobody has any idea really what to do when you're talking about the Trojans and their recruiting. So, and this week, Willie Taggart was fired by Florida State, and we've seen a ton of questions sent in my direction about Jaylan Knighton and what the Buckeyes would do as far as re-engaging with that former Florida State commitment who reopened his recruitment on Monday. But what happens when USC decides to make this switch is incredibly important for Ohio State recruiting on the West Coast because, you know, they've dismissed the idea of the notion of Urban Meyer going to coach out there, but they're obviously going to be looking to make a splash. And, you know, we've lobbied, or lobbed the name James Franklin around in our private conversations. And I think he's a guy that makes a lot of sense for Hollywood.
I would think so.
And it'll be very curious to see this momentum that's been gained by Ohio State on the West Coast. And again, Lettermen Row was out there a week ago, and we sat down with Clark Phillips and Court Williams and CJ Stroud and Bo Collins. All these guys that have decided really they're not that interested in USC at all. Things are going to get different. And I think, and Court Williams told me that USC and Texas A&M are the only programs that are still recruiting him and trying to get him to flip from Ohio State. So there's all these pieces of the puzzle that are interesting. And do you think that Florida State made the decision to move on from Willie Taggart when they did to try in some way to get a one-up on USC potentially when it comes to, because there's only a handful of names out there, right? Coaches that are worth really going after hardcore, you know, with a lot of money, and James Franklin is on that list. Do you think that there's any relation to those decisions?
Possibly, but I also don't think we know what Florida State will do.
I don't think anyone can, of course.
Only because Bobby Bowden was the coach there from the mid-'70s when college football was a completely different sport. They had Jimbo Fisher in-house to take over. He was the coach in waiting. Yeah. You were still allowed to do that. Then have a coach in waiting, just hanging out there. Then they hire Willie Taggart, and it's an unmitigated disaster. And so they have not really been able to hire a football coach since the mid-'70s that had success. So You don't know what Florida State's going to do. If I was Florida State, yes, you need to get a leg up on USC. If you want the biggest name you can possibly get, which is James Franklin, you have to get a head start on it.
Yeah, I mean, they just paid $20 million essentially for a buyout of the entire staff at Florida State, right?
They're cleaning house.
And I don't know that there's any interest from James Franklin in leaving Penn State, and I want to be clear about that. I don't want to start rumors or whatever, but I know that a guy like him is going to be a target for those schools because he has to be. But when you talk about James Franklin's choices, potentially, wouldn't you pick USC over Florida State?
Every time you walk into a restaurant in Tallahassee or college or State College, you are the number one guy in every place you go. You are the guy. If you go to a restaurant or anywhere in Los Angeles, you're probably the fifth most famous person there. The lifestyle of living in Los Angeles is not just sitting on Manhattan Beach when you get an off day. It's a weight off your back where you don't have to be seen as the mayor.
But doesn't USC need a star?
But USC does need a star. But I'm saying on the coach's end, you're never the most important person in the room unless you're at a USC ball or gala or something. That's just the coach's aspect. But USC has to make a splash, and I think Florida State has to make a splash because Florida made a splash with Dan Mullen. Mm-hmm. Clemson is splashing every year with Dabo Swinney. USC is falling behind Mario Cristobal. USC is falling behind, I would even say, Herm Edwards in the recruiting game. Both of those programs are in dire need of a star. USC just has to have one more because for USC to be relevant in Los Angeles, it has to be so much better than everything else. Florida State can be 8-4 and still be the most relevant thing in town.
And still be the best team in the ACC Coastal.
That's true. But yeah, they both need splashes. And like you said, USC
is that the Coastal? I don't know my divisions.
No, it is not actually. It's
division
the
math.
Atlantic.
I'm not good at math. We've talked about that.
Division jibber jabber.
It's all the division jibber jabber. So the reality is, USC, like Georgia was a few years ago when Kirby Smart took the job there, is an absolute sleeping giant in college football, and they were awakened for a few years under Pete when old Pete Carroll was there. And then they went back to sleep. But they were asleep for a few years before that. If they can find a coach there that is able to just embrace the Hollywood life, which what Pete Carroll did very well, but also not cheat like a crazy bastard like Pete Carroll did, then I think that you have an opportunity to walk into a program and dominate college football, or at least be elevated into that conversation of Ohio State, Georgia, USC, Clemson, Alabama for the next decade or longer.
Let's just put it this way. If Urban Meyer walked into Clay Helton's office right now and just put a name tag on the desk, he would have a top 15 recruiting class instantly.
In a week.
In 1 week. Yep. It would not matter. And so for USC, the home run is the most important thing. Florida State might be able to worry about fit.
Yeah, Florida State, I think, needs like a triple, with maybe like a walk that happens after it, and all of a sudden you got runners on the corner with nobody out, and you're feeling pretty good about your inning. But like USC has to hit a home run, and I just think it's fascinating, and it's something I mentioned to somebody the other day. I don't remember who. If in recruiting and in college coaching, if you know the determination is going to happen eventually, it needs to happen immediately. And I'm fascinated by the fact that USC has not moved on from Clay Helton yet, especially now because they don't have an athletic director. And I assume as soon as their athletic director hiring becomes official, then that news will follow, because the new AD is sort of on a mandate, I guess, to come in and wipe things out. But it's just really weird and interesting to me to see how long they wait for that to happen. But anyway, let's talk about Florida State for a second, because I want to dive into what I talked about on Lettermen Row earlier this week, is JAYLAN Knighton. Everyone is wondering, will the Buckeyes go after JAYLAN Knighton? Will the Buckeyes go after JAYLAN Knighton, the Deerfield Beach running back who had committed to Ohio State privately in the summer and then ended up flipping his commitment to Florida State without really telling anybody in Columbus? So the truth is, JAYLAN Knighton, and as I wrote about in early September on Lettermen Row, reached out to the Buckeyes then and wanted to try to see where things stood and if there was any interest. And there's been some conversation between September and now, but there is not any real avenue for JAYLAN Knighton to end up in this Ohio State class, even if he visits for the Penn State game, which has been reported that he may. It is not going to happen between Ohio State and JAYLAN Knighton. So I think people have to take the things that you read with a grain of salt, because high school coaches, high school players are given an opportunity to sort of voice their take on things or put their opinion or their spin on things into the public specter. And it doesn't mean anything if it's not a position that's corroborated and reciprocated by the staff that they're reaching out to.
Ohio State doesn't get to play the underdog card very often.
Right.
But when you do something that makes Ohio State seem like an underdog, they're going to use it. And JAYLAN Knighton, for lack of better words, slapping Ohio State in the face and not telling them anything and just, okay, I'm going to Florida State now. Because the minute he was done with that visit, you saw Florida State recruiting sites and things going nuts before Ohio State even had a clue what was going on. And so he kind of abandoned Ohio State, and Ohio State now all of a sudden is like, oh, you want back in? Well, you there's a bridge burnt.
The recruiting process reveals a lot about who these young men are and what type of people are around them, as far as what they're encouraging them to do, how they're learning to handle their behavior. It's not always fail-proof. It's not like there's never kids who mess up that don't get back in good graces with staffs or whatever. But ultimately, I think in some instances, especially when you're recruiting the people and player caliber that Ohio State is doing, once you see that big red flag, right? Like sometimes it's hard to say, you know what, we're over that. And I don't think Ohio State is holding a grudge or anything like that, so I don't want it to seem like they're actively anti-JAYLAN Knighton as a person or anything like that, because it's just not the case. But the fit that they thought that they had with him is not there. And again, you may see things about JAYLAN Knighton wanting to come visit. I'm sure he does. I'm sure a lot of kids want to come watch that Ohio State-Penn State game. But that doesn't mean he's being recruited by Ohio State so much as it means that there's conversation. And there's a difference between recruiting conversation and regular conversation. So that's what I want to say about that.
Burb, do you have a recruiting? I was going to ask you. You don't even know that I was going to ask you either.
Ooh.
Do you have a recruiting list, the guys that are coming in for this Maryland game? Because I know the Penn State game is much bigger, But the Maryland game, is there a list of guys? Are there?
No, not yet. I mean, the truth is, and this is one of those weird things, and fans are always complaining on Twitter and stuff right now about the noon game, right? The noon game, the big noon, Fox big noon game. In a lot of ways, I'm fine with noon games, and I'm happy that they happen because obviously for us covering them means our day is over a lot earlier. But there's no doubt that it impacts Ohio State's ability to get recruits on campus. Like Landon Jackson, the 5-star defensive end from Texarkana, Texas, was supposed to be coming up this weekend for the Maryland game. He's not going to be. It's not because of the noon game, is from what I've been told, but you got to figure if it's a 7 o'clock game at night, maybe it makes it easier for kids to get up. But the biggest name that's coming to visit is JAHMYR GIBBS, the running back from Dalton, Georgia, the Georgia Tech commitment. He is up there on the top of that list of running back possibilities for Ohio State, along with Mayan Williams. And I think this is a really important, it's an unofficial visit, so it's an opportunity for the Buckeyes to put a good foot forward for him and his family to get him back for an official visit. He's visited Alabama. He's got an offer from there. Florida, Georgia is lurking around. LSU's offered. As long as Georgia doesn't offer and Gibbs decides he wants to go somewhere other than Georgia Tech, which I think that there's actually a better than not chance that he does stay with Georgia Tech because he's kind of a homebody, likes to stay close. But again, when you want to talk about going to a place where you can win championships, he may have to make a decision that puts him outside of his comfort zone. I don't think Alabama's pushing for him right now, despite the fact that they offered. They do have 2 commitments already from running backs. They're still chasing Zach Evans, the number 1 ranked running back in the country. I think that it's an opportunity for Ohio State to make a real move. And so that's the one visit that I think is the most important. I know that Jackson Smith and Jigba will make his official visit to Ohio State this weekend. So he'll be back in town for the 3rd game this year. But there isn't any sort of major recruiting thing happening until Penn State. So just the real story is whether or not Gibbs makes it up to campus or not.
All right. Better that I ask than to not tell the people who's going to be here.
Tell the people what they want, Spencer. I want you to subscribe to Lettermen Row on YouTube. I want you to hit that little bell that's in the corner. Which side is it?
I don't know what corner.
I think it's over there. Hit the bell over there, and that'll alert you when we got new content on the YouTubes. Make sure you rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeart, Podcasts. What other things?
I don't know.
We don't know.
You're on your own here.
But that will take care of today's episode of Talking Stuff, the Ohio State Recruiting Podcast on Lettermen Row. I am Jeremy Birmingham. That is Spencer Holbrook, and we will talk to you again in a few days. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe below to get the latest videos from Lettermen Row.
We got Letterman Live, we've got the practice report, we got rapid reaction. Hey, and we got Buckeye IQ with Zach Bourne.
For sure. We got recruiting breakdowns with Berm. We got whatever you need. Ohio State